the music and let's start. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us today for Module 3 of the School for Change Agents. We've got nearly 400 participants taking part in terms of lines, and we know that actually there are many more of you than that because lots of people are taking part in groups, and also hello to the people that are joining us on YouTube, and hello to the people who are watching this in recording. So our theme for week 3, there are two themes that are connected, and they're the themes that actually people taking part in the school have asked us for the most. So the first part of the session will be talking about dealing with resistance to change, and the second part will talk about being resilient. And it's going to be a double-headed session today because I'm very happy to be joined by my colleague from the Horizons team, Catherine Pereira. So I'm going to run the first part, and then Catherine's going to run the rest of the session. So let's get going. So just in terms of roles, as I said, Catherine and I are going to be co-presenting today. And in terms of who else is taking part, one of the things that we do in the Horizons team is that we run the whole WebEx ourselves. So everybody you see here is a member of the Horizons team. So as I'm in Sweden today, and we wanted to make sure that things worked well, I'm very happy to say that my colleague Dom has been here with me, and it's just as well that he was. Because he's sorted a few things out, that's great. Then in terms of colleagues that are doing technical support, we say hello to Paul and Pardeep, Rosie and Ollie. In terms of our colleagues who are going to be keeping an eye on things in the chat monitor, we have Kate and we have Ian. So just to make sure we can hear you, Kate and Ian, do you both want to just say hello? I'll mute you both.
Hi, can you hear me?
Not very well, Ian,
hello?
But a little bit.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. And Kate, say hello.
Okay. I don't think
Hi,
Kate's
Kate.
with us today. I don't think Kate's with us today.
I think Kate's
with
us. Hi, no, she's here. Hi,
Yeah.
Kate. Hi.
Oh, good.
And
Hi.
Lee and Lynette are going to be joining us, looking after Twitter. And what we're going to do is I'm going to get Lee to speak in a moment. So we'll test you out then, Lee, and get you to say hello. And the person behind the scenes looking after people taking part and dealing with anybody who's having trouble getting on is Caroline. So here we all are in the Horizons team doing our roles. So again, one of the things that makes these sessions so special is just how much we all join in. So we love that you are putting loads of comments and ideas and connections in the chat box. So please carry on doing that. If you are having a problem and you want some support, what we ask you to do is to raise your virtual hand, which is underneath the participant section, and we will come and find you. And we're not only, running this this module, with a presentation happening and the chat box, we're also on Twitter. So again, we'd love you to join in the conversation on Twitter. And if you can make sure that you put hashtag S4CA on all your tweets, and we'd also like you to follow the school, which is SCH, SCH4 Change. So yeah, we'd like to hear you on Twitter. And just because there's so many of us taking part and the chat box is so fast and furious, if you are replying to someone in the chat box, can you use @ and the name of that person, and that way we can thread the conversations together and it's better for everyone. So at this point, I was just going to hand over to Lee, and what we decided to do is, rather than do a poll or an annotation this week, we would just give a little bit of feedback on what's happening in our wonderful, amazing School for Change Agent community. So Lee, tell us a few things about what's happening.
Thanks, Helen. Hello, everybody. It's all of you, our community, who make school what it is. So we just wanted to take a moment to show our appreciation to our community for the support you show to us, and most importantly to one another. So we loved seeing your posts on social media, your feedback, what resonates with you, and the connections you're making with one another all over the world. So thank you to Rosie very much for collating this slide. We had loads of brilliant tweets and Facebook posts to choose from, saying how you're getting on with school and what's resonating with you, and things like, for example, the randomised coffee trial you're looking forward to. So thank you very much. Here, please keep going on our Facebook group and on Twitter as well. We're loving to see, we're loving seeing your feedback. Thank you very much, and back over to Helen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lee. And can we just put something in the chat box about the Facebook page? So you know, if anybody you know, wants to sign up to our Facebook group, we'd love to have you in the group. So let's get going on our key topics for module 3. So I'm going to do the first bit. I'm going to lead on that around resistance, and you know why it's an important topic. I want to talk about resistance versus reactance, because actually an awful lot of the time when we think people are being resistant to change, it isn't resistance, it's reactance. And of all the kind of ideas that I've learned about resistance to change, actually when I learned about reactance, it was a real breakthrough for me, and I hope it'll feel like that for you as well. And then we've got some good tactics on how to avoid or overcome reactance. And then I'm going to hand over to Catherine. Catherine, do you want to tell us what the themes that you're going to talk about here on the agenda?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Lovely. Hello, what a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk mainly about resilience, which is the thing that the Horizons team gets asked about most in our work. I'm going to talk about what it is, and how we build our resilience muscles. And I'm going to link it to some other themes that Helen's covered, including love and passion, and also a new idea called grit. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I love the idea that we're going to have love, grit and passion as part of our school. I think that's really cool. So let's get going on the content. So, you know, when we talk about resistance, okay, you know, technically what resistance means is any force that stops or slows down movement. So here, you know, we've got resistance bands in the gym. And what I would say is just the very fact we think of it in this way, it's like, you know, this is a force that's kind of going in a positive direction, and resistance is like something negative that stops or slows it. I think, you know, I would kind of really question. So I've got some data here. This is from McKinsey, so it's got to be right. And what this is about is how, you know, in terms of organizational change programs, okay, we know that many of them fail to achieve their objectives. And why does that happen? So, you know, if you look at these different factors here that are reported in this McKinsey study, what it shows us is the vast majority of reasons that are reported as to why change fails are to do with resistance in some form. So 39% of the time, it's because employees are resistant to change. Okay, and interestingly, 33% of the time is because management behaviour does not support change, which actually I would say is a form of resistance. So what we're saying is, you know, these issues around resistance are perceived to be, you know, the most challenging issues. So the next thing I'd ask is, you know, are we surprised at this? Is anybody taking part in this session today surprised at this? This is a really interesting review which Deloitte published in 2016. And it's called Humanizing Change, Developing More Effective Change Management Strategies. And this is a document that's free that anybody can download. And I think it's got some really interesting content. And I just pulled a couple of things out from this, you know. What they're saying is most change management programs or, you know, management initiatives begin with an assumption that is fundamentally flawed, which is we're going to make this change happen and that all the parties involved in the change share an overwhelmingly common interest. And what the researchers say is we consistently underestimate power dynamics, and that's why we talk so much about power in the school, contextual considerations, you know, that every context is different, and resistance to change. not only do we underestimate them, in many cases, we consider them anomalous, which means they don't really matter. And the researchers say, after all, organisational change means changing organisational behaviour, notwithstanding little evidence suggesting that behaviour can be pliable or predictable. So I think any of us that are change agents, we need to be thinking about these factors. Okay, what I want to do next is I want to give you the two best pieces of advice about thinking about resistance to change. Okay, the first comes from Mark Jabin, and he is an emergency physician in Florida, USA, and he has made it his life's mission to study the science behind resistance to change. And what he says here, looking at this little diagram, he says this is what we shouldn't do. This is what we shouldn't do, but what we consistently do. So we identify an issue, say, a patient safety issue or a finance gap or a quality problem. And what we do is a small group of people, often senior leaders, maybe they'll bring in some experts, they will identify what our desired outcome is to address this issue. And then they'll come up with a set of options and possibilities and some data, and they will analyze those and make a choice. And it's at this point that we engage people. And what Mark Jabin says is it's what we shouldn't do. Okay, this is what he says we should do. Okay, as soon as we identify that there is an issue that needs addressing, we should start engaging people straight away. And when we say people, the people who will be impacted by or need to be part of the change. So what we need to do is make the desired outcome a shared outcome. And we need to make the options shared options. And we need to make the choices shared choices. And, if we follow the Mark Jabin approach to change, actually we should ban the word buy-in. I think, buy-in to change. How do we get the clinicians to buy into change? We should ban it, okay? Because actually we don't need buyers who buy into change. It's too late. We need people who are investors. So if we want to overcome resistance to change, we have to create resistors. We don't have to create resistors. We have to create investors. People who will, who have got a vested interest or got some power to make or break the change. We need to involve them right at the start. And this is my second piece of best advice about resistance to change. And this is a lovely quote from Harold Shermer. And he says, very often, resistant behavior is a good indicator of missing relevance. And again, people aren't going to invest in change if it isn't meaningful and relevant to me and my situation and my interests. So, we need to be thinking about that right from the start. How can we create change that's meaningful and that is relevant to people? Now, let's go back. Do you remember last week in module 2, we talked about the relationship between structure and agency. And we said very often when large scale change happens, particularly in public service, we focus on the structural mechanisms like, performance goals and regulation and program management and incentive systems. And we need to do those things. But actually, one of the most effective, quickest ways that we can make change happen is to build agency. Okay, and we defined agency as the power to make a positive difference. And we as change agents need to be building that power. Okay, and here are some of the things that we talked about last week, how we do that with activation, building capability, social movements, solidarity, and so on. And we need to be working with both. Okay, here's another slide that we looked at in terms of structure and agency. We said it's about rules versus freedom. Because at the end of the day, okay, agency is about the freedom to do the things that fit with our values and connect with who we are in the world. So if our focus in the school is about change agency and change agents, let's think about resistance to change in that context. So, very often when we're talking about being resistant to change, okay, or other people being resistant to change, or we're feeling resistant to change, okay, a big issue and a distinction that has really helped me as a change agent is understanding what's going on. And is what's going on like resistance? Like, has this person got a resistant personality? Or are they being difficult and not playing along? Or is what's happening reactance? Okay, so I am now going to give us a crash course on reactance. So just bear with me as I take us through what it means. So our starting point for thinking about reactance is to go back, to some really fundamental issues around what do we need in the world? Okay, what basic needs do we have to do our best in the world? And this is from a particular theory which is called self-determination theory, which comes from Ryan and Deci. And there's a few other theories around, okay? But this particular one says, as human beings, for us to do our best, we need competence, so we need to feel that we've got the skills and the knowledge to do the job. We need relatedness, which means that we need to connect with other people. And we need autonomy, which means that we need the space and the freedom and the agency, okay, to do our very best, okay. And of all those three, what these psychologists that develop this theory say is the one that is most important to us is autonomy. We need a sense of freedom and space and agency so that we can do our jobs. Okay, so bearing that in mind, what we just said, here's a little question. Okay, here again, we've got two research psychologists. They put two signs on the walls of college bathrooms in the USA. And one set of bathrooms they put on the walls, do not write on these walls under any circumstances. And on the other set of bathrooms, they put, do not write on these walls. Okay, what do you think they found when they went back after 2 weeks? Okay, let's maybe put a few little comments in the chat box here. Okay, what do you think they found? Yeah, I think you got it mostly. What they basically found was when a sign was put on the wall saying, do not write on these walls under any circumstances, people wrote on the walls, okay? It was like a red rag to get people to write on the walls, okay? That is reactance, okay? Reactance is when we tell people not to do something that people feel is a threat to their freedom or their agency or their autonomy, okay? Let me give you another example now. Okay, so Catherine and I were in a conversation last week, and we have a new system for it's going to be the basis of our new website, and for us to kind of blog and share content, and the people that set this up for us, they set us up in a competition with half the Horizons team in one team and half the Horizons team in the other, and we have to compete against each other. And honestly, if it was my choice, I wouldn't get us competing with each other. But you know what? We signed up to it as a team, and we have to do it. And Catherine, okay, missed the initial training, and she's in the same team as me. So I'm saying to Catherine, look, we've signed up to this, and we're the leaders in the team, so we've got to be role models in this. You need to do this, okay? And so this is what Catherine said to me. I don't like being told what to do. Okay, if you tell me I have to do something, I will do the opposite. So Catherine, okay, tell us what was happening for you at that point.
Well, I think that the key thing here is, it's very funny to me that you're using this example, because it is, in hindsight, quintessential reactance, right?
It is.
So what I'm saying is I'm contrary by nature, but actually the evidence is suggesting that we all have that streak. We maybe have more or less latitude to exercise it. And that if you tell me to do something, even if I really want to do it and to understand, what it does is push me away. And with the example that you're giving, I was completely up for doing it. But what I needed was the space to make some sense of it for myself. And that's what I was reacting to.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah. So me coming along and saying, Catherine, we're the leaders, we've got to do this, you know, please get on and do it. It created that reaction in you, okay?
Right.
And you know, you're right, you know, we're all like this. So reactance is exactly what Catherine said there, you know, it's our instantaneous reaction to being told what to do, okay, in a way that that kind of threatens our autonomy or our agency. And you know, here are some researchers. Here's a proper definition of it. Okay, reactance is an unpleasant motivational arousal that emerges when people experience a loss or a threat or a loss to their free behaviours. And you know, this happens to me all the time. Tell me to do something in a way that, you know, I don't like and that I see as a kind of a threat to my freedoms, and I will react. Okay, so when I feel reactance, okay, this is how it makes me feel. Okay, it makes me feel, if somebody's telling me to do something, I want to do the opposite of what they're telling me to do. And actually, somebody telling me to, you know, to do something in this way, it drives me to engage in the behaviour that is forbidden or restricted even more. It makes me feel uncomfortable, aggressive, angry, and it makes me want to sulk. And you know, it's an emotional reaction. It makes me react against the they, you know, they are making me do this. It means I lose the big picture of stuff because I'm getting an emotional reaction. It increases my resistance to being persuaded because I've reacted emotionally. And but what's interesting about reactance, it gives me an urge to do something. And so reactance is very different to like learned helplessness. So you know, very often people in organizations are so worn down, there's so many rules that they just kind of accept it passively. I think the kind of people that are change agents, you know, I think we're much more likely to display reactance. And you know, like, I need to do something about this. It's outrageous. Don't tell me what to do. And I think, you know, an awful lot of situations where we get resistance to change, it isn't resistance, it's reactance. And the thing about reactance, it's almost totally avoidable, you know. And again, the same kind of behaviours that that we exhibit when we're you know, we're behaving in a reactance way are the same as a 2-year-old. Okay. So those of you that are interested, I just put some additional resources here. I didn't put them in alphabetical order because I like to promote free things rather than things under a paywall. But the first couple here are free resources. So do some more reading on reactance. It's really interesting. Okay, how do we avoid or overcome reactance? Okay, and here are 8 ways of doing it. Number 1, you know, look at what Mark Jabin said. Okay, don't ask people to buy in. When we ask people to buy in, we're likely to get reactance. Building cooperation and investment right from the start. Secondly, understand the person that we want, you know, to engage in change. So listen and understand where they're coming from. You know, find their starting point, find some common interests. Okay, if people react in a reactance way, okay, roll with the resistance, right? Don't argue back against them. Be curious and accepting that they're reacting in this way and find out why. Okay. Some of the researchers suggest that we have a foot in the door approach, which means ask people to do something small and kind of get your foot in the door and then ask them to do something bigger. Okay. Number 5, build social support, because one of the things that happens when we're acting with reactance is we kind of lose our perspective. So we need people kind of around us to put it back together again. Okay. One of the key things that we need to do is avoid being condescending to other people, because that is one of the easiest ways to spark reactance. So I put a little picture here, you know, stop talking at me, start talking to me if you want to avoid reactance. Okay. The next one is give the person time, because we get like an emotional response, you know, it kind of flares up. Don't tell me to do that. I'm not doing it. Okay. Just give them time to cool down a bit. And then we can get back to normal. And a final thing that really helps in terms of, you know, thinking about this in a wider sense is to run a break the rules campaign, which is a really cool thing to do. So there's some really very good resources around breaking rules. So this here comes from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement USA, and they've got, breaking the rules for better care. So if we want to avoid situations of reactance, and a lot of people doing that, let's actually, turn it the other way around, and let's think about how can we break the rules. What are the rules in our organisations that get in the way and stop us delivering great care or great services or whatever else it is that you do? Okay, what are the rules that you would like to break? And IHI, in their resources, they talk about 3 kinds of rules that we might want to break. The first kind of rules are habits or myths that are perceived to be rules, but that might not actually be. They're kind of rules in our heads. Okay. Second group are administrative rules or policies that actually our organizational leaders can change, because the policies or the rules make absolutely no sense. All they do is make us react against them. And number 3 are rules that are, in the wider context. So, they're rules that the regulators have put in place, or they're government policy. They're beyond the rules of the organization, but they're things that our leaders can advocate on. I've worked to break the rules of quite a lot of different organisations now, and there's one of these 3 kinds of rules that people want to break the most. Okay, which kind of rule do you think consistently, when you do this with a big group of people, they want to break the most? Do you think they want to break rule 1, break rule 2, or break rule 3? What do you think? That's interesting. I'd say, just looking at what we're putting there, actually most people, or the biggest group, are rule 2, but actually the biggest group by a long way, once you start looking at this, is actually rule 1. Okay, so many rules around who can talk to who in the organization, and pecking orders. Typically about 2/3 of the rules, once you start analysing them, are actually are rule number 1. And then what we do is we can take this a step further. So if you remember this has been in both our modules so far, and I think it might be coming in again. It's our favourite picture. This idea that certainly in the National Health Service in England, this sense of a permission culture. I can't even make small change happen in my service because I don't have permission. So let's actually flip this round. And as well as starting off with breaking the rules, actually, what permissions do we want? And actually, let's work with people across our whole team or our whole organisation, and let's give everyone permission. And I think, particularly in a context where what we find is that when we do campaigns to break the rules, actually most of the rules that people want to break are in people's heads. Let's flip it and let's talk about what permissions are we going to give. And one of the things that we know, a positive permission culture is a really good way of building change agency, and that's what we want to do. So I'm going to just stop there. So first of all, can we just hear from our chat monitors? So Kate, Ian, what are you hearing in the chat box?
Okay, do you want me to go first? Okay.
Yeah, go first, Ian. That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so the caveman cartoon certainly got quite a bit of discussion going, and quite a bit of interest, and a lot of sympathy for Catherine in terms of the
working with me
quote.
Yes.
and Debbie confessed that she'd been like Catherine since she was a child, and that she needed time to think through the reasons first, and also some good advice, I thought, from Jono when you're faced with reactor type people. Be positive to people who react. Don't ignore them, which I think was leading on nicely to a co-creation discussion as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That's it's really great, and I'm glad that the idea is resonating with people. Kate, anything to add?
Yeah, just saying that people are already getting excited about connecting for the randomised coffee trial, which is fantastic. And there was discussion around the difference between buy-in and engagement, and what
an investment,
the line draw. Yeah, and I think that's kind of like quite an interesting point. And there was also some points about where does tools such as PDSA cycles fit into that process as well, when we think about how we deliver that with those aspects in mind. So yeah, great discussions going on. So thank you.
Fantastic. And Lee, would you like to say what's happening on Twitter?
Hi everyone. People have been really enjoying the concept of reactance and how we can turn things on their head to get through what we might see as resistance to change. People are really enjoying the concept of curiosity as well, and how lovely that is. It's quite a refreshing, appealing way to look at things. And there's a lovely tweet from Sean, who says that reframing is so important. When we're in the middle of transformational change, we need to always respect the autonomy of our teams and not force compliance, which I think sums it up quite well. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And again, you know, when we force compliance, that's when we get reactance. Really good. So at this point, I am going to pass over to Catherine, who is going to take us through the next stage of the session. So Catherine, you start, and I will get you the presentation board.
Well, thanks so much for that, Helen. And I guess I need no introduction now to everyone, so I've had that already. And as a serious point, I will be doing most of the module next week, which will be on how we move from me to we, and I will give a fuller introduction of myself then, but I will settle on the snippet that Helen has given you of me to date. I'm going to be transitioning from resistance, reactance, and into resilience, which, as I said, is the thing that we get asked most about in Horizons. And, you know, you can kind of summarize it in this question. Why is it that some people seem to be able to take knocks and challenges and work through them well, and possibly work through them better than others? So that's what we're going to be exploring next. And I want to put you in mind of something that we saw in Module 2, where Helen talked about these two ideas, the idea of the contributor and the compliant. You know, the contributor as somebody who is connected to a higher purpose, has a direction which is about shared goals and values, embraces change and is seeking ways to collaborate, and works to who they are rather than to a list of what they have to do. And what we're going to be exploring in this section is how we can apply that in the way that we approach resilience. So first up, just what are we talking about when we talk about resilience? So we're using this definition here. It's the ability of an individual to adjust to adversity, maintain equilibrium, retain a sense of control over their environment, and continue to move on in a positive way. And we're taking that definition from a number of sources, but particularly the work of Deborah Jackson and her colleagues, who did a lot of research looking at personal resilience as it relates to midwives and nurses. So when we look at resilience, we're not just talking about our capacity to take knocks. We're talking about resilience as an opportunity for personal growth over time. In other words, resilience here is about how we respond to setbacks and how we use those setbacks to become stronger through experience over time. So in a way, you could say this is about our spiritual and our psychological muscles, right? As much as training the body is about our physical strength. And one of the things that I think links resilience and reactance as a way of framing resistance is this idea of a mindset. Okay, so when I say mindset, I mean the established set of attitudes that a person holds. What is my approach to a given problem, and what do I believe about it in terms of the way that I know the world? You know, and for a long time, we believed as a culture that we operated within a fixed mindset. Okay, so much like the body would develop through childhood, through adolescence and form, we believed that the same thing happened to the mind. And at a certain point, we were, if you like, fixed in the way that we think about the world and our place in it. And that idea has really been challenged, particularly in the field of psychology over the last 30 years. And in particular by the work that's been led by an extraordinary woman called Carol Dweck, Professor Dweck, who developed the idea of the growth mindset. And this is simply the idea that our capacity, not just to absorb information, but to continue to learn and to build our psychological and spiritual and intellectual muscles throughout our life, is a continuous process. In other words, that applied effort and hard work, as well as brains and talent, as it was known when I was young, are important in terms of what we're able to accomplish in the world. I love this idea. I think it feeds very well into what we do in school, but it also has quite a sound evidence basis. If you look at, for example, neuroscientific evidence, the understanding that we now have of how the brain's plasticity works, how the ability to create new neural pathways based on experience, and how that continues right through our lives rather than being formed and then fixed, is very consistent with the idea of a growth mindset. And when we think about resilience, not simply as something that happens to us and we then react, but as something that we can use as a resource to become more effective change agents, then it sits squarely in this space. So I'm going to introduce you to Carol Dweck. And here's a quotation that she gave about her work on growth mindset. She said, "If parents want to give their children a gift, the best thing they can do is to teach their children to love challenges, be intrigued by mistakes, enjoy effort, and keep on learning. That way," she said, "their children don't just have to be slaves of praise. They will have a lifelong way to build and repair their own confidence," which I think is an extraordinary idea. It's great for children, but it's also, I think, a helpful narrative for any of us at any point in our lives. So, you know, what we're looking at here is taking these challenging ideas, applying them to this idea of resilience, and thinking about how we grow it over time. And our colleague Lee has done another of her beautiful sketch notes that I'm going to introduce you to now. So I asked Lee to do a sketch note that would explain 10 practical ways to build resilience. And you know, one of the things that we get asked for a lot in school is, how do we take these amazing concepts and really apply them practically? So what I'm hoping we can do now is go through and look at a few of these ideas as snapshots for what we can do practically in order to strengthen that resilience muscle. So the first one I want to highlight is choose your battles, right? Don't sweat the small stuff. So this is the idea that if I find myself in a repetitive loop of behavior, take a step back and ask myself, is the difficulty that I'm experiencing here worth the effort in order to achieve the effective goal that I'm striving for in the long term, you know? And sometimes the answer to that is yes, and that's a battle that we might want to choose. But you know, more often for me, when I step back and try and get perspective on something, I realize that I'm in a loop of repetitive and ultimately futile behavior that I have a responsibility to shift out of. So, you know, choosing battles isn't just about the win. It's also about knowing when we need to hold back. And in a sense, that's being aware of our own energies. In Horizons, we are big fans of old proverbs. We feel that there's a lot of wisdom to be gained from looking at how different cultures look at the same issues. This is one of my favorites. It's an old Cherokee proverb. And it's this: if your horse dies, get off it. Kind of says it all, right? I love that one. So second one I want to pull up is something that Helen's already touched on, and I think is linked to reactance, which is, you know, people who have the potential to wear me down, they have good intentions. And so there's something about talking and finding out what they are. In community organizing, we say, you know, very few people have a narrative about themselves that they are a difficult and willfully obstructive person, right? So part of our work is to find out what that narrative is, what it is they're trying to do, and to kind of push through it. And in a way, I would want to draw a distinction between being critical, which is absolutely vital, and sometimes being that person who is wearing for other people around us. You know, are we at risk of being one of the people who's wearing others down? It's okay to be critical, but be aware of how much energy it's taking in order to hold that space, and think about whether there's a more constructive space that you can use. A friend said to me when she looked at this, you know, it's kind of those people who feel a bit like a shriveled balloon. You know, it's not quite buoyant. It's not really giving you energy. The party hasn't got started. So think about where we're contributing in that space. Third one from Lee, which is one of my favorites and possibly one of the hardest to do. It's, you know, celebrate our achievements, however small. So the reality of victories is that they are almost always compromised. In other words, they're not delivered to us on a plate, perfectly formed as we imagined them in our minds. Okay, that's just a fact. So the skill, I think, here is learning to release the balloons when we have something even really small that we can celebrate. And I would link this to one of the most striking trends that we've seen in healthcare improvement over the last 10 years, which is a celebration of joy at work. You know, the Institute of Healthcare Improvement have now put joy at work equal as one of the 4 pillars of what will make an effective healthcare system of the future. And I think that this is very much linked to the idea of joy not being something that is floating around ethereally. It's something that we actively help to create. So I want to introduce you to Henry Nouwen, who was a philosopher, a religious man, also a great writer. And he wrote a lot about spiritual joy. And I love this quote. Henry says, joy does not simply happen to us. We have to choose joy and keep choosing it every day. You know, I think that that's a very profound idea, but I also think to say it is simple, but to practice it for many of us can be difficult. I want to link it back to something that we saw in Module 1, where Helen explained the idea of Huxley and new truths as heresies, but also this beautiful piece of art. You know, all my good ideas are battles. And for some of us, that pursuit of joy on a daily basis, the constant reframing of what we're experiencing and trying to shift our mindset can feel as much as a struggle. And I think that when we're looking at how we practically apply these techniques, there's one thing of thinking about my own resilience, but there's also that piece about how do I build the resilience of others? How do I help others with the battles that they're facing? So I'm going to go through a couple of others, and I'm going to stop then briefly for some chat. Fifth, have a network of supportive people. You know, this is what school is all about. It's an opportunity for us to jump in and to say, I am much stronger into relationship with other people, and giving yourself space where you can build that in your life. If you ask any activist how she understands the world, she will say power. And if you ask her what her first question is, she will say, who are my people? Okay, so it's about asking that question, who are my people, creatively, widely. Very simple practical exercise that you could do if you're joining us today as a group is to sit down with that question, who are my people, and start to map it out and look within 4 or 5 minutes as where you as a group have connections and how you can use those to achieve small changes. So before I come back to the chat monitors, I just want to link a few of the other points in Lee's sketch note. Look after yourself, both your physical and your mental health. You know, again, easier said than done. And if Lee had more space, I'm sure she would say that the role we play in looking after each other is of equal importance. And it links to the idea of self-care. You know, I think this is important. You know, often when we think of how we survive and how we're resilient, we think about it as enduring things that are happening to us. Endurance is not the same as coping and recharging. In one of my previous lives, I practiced law. I was a barrister. And, you know, sometimes you would rock up at court in the morning and the barristers on the other side would have been up all night, and they would tell you this proudly as though this were a great achievement. And, you know, a lot of that is a nonsense for those of us who want to make change, because enduring rather than recharging is actively destructive to our ability to sustain effective change efforts over time. Yeah. So this idea of self-care is not simply an afterthought. It's not simply waiting till my body breaks down before I take care steps. So those of you who have access to the chat and social media. I'd love it if you could share some examples of things that you do that build your sense of care, things that other people might get inspiration from, that you weave into your day. The final couple of ideas I want to share on this point is, while we can take inspiration from what others do, ultimately we have to make sense of resilience for ourselves. And I want to link this back to something that was shared in an earlier module about how we make change spread, because I think the same principles apply. So often when we think about, how am I going to build my resilience? We take ideas from others and we try and force them into our own lives. I think there's a better way of doing this. And I'm going to take Helen's frame of ACE, which comes from the work of Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms, who've written a book called New Power. And the idea here is to take one small action which has meaning for you, make it actionable in your life. So I want you, as an exercise, whether you're joining in groups or individually, after today's session, just take 2 minutes and think back to your childhood. Think about something that you loved doing, okay? And then I want you to think about how you can capture that same joy in one small action that you take. The next step is to think about how that connects to someone else. Is it something you can do with someone? Is it something you can do for someone? Is it something that you simply tell someone about? Because we know that when we meld that connection, we're more likely to stick with an action over time. And finally, make your data visual. Collect it, make meaning of it, adapt what you're doing. So creating a cycle of what you're learning, what that helps you to know, and how you adapt it over time. In other words, make what you're doing extensible so that you can join it in different ways and other people can join in with you. Very simple exercise that we can take in order to foster our resilience. And the final one for me, and then I'm going to come warning to our chat monitors to see what other ideas people have been sharing, is this one. Learn from mistakes, move forward. I would say try not to be afraid of the gap between expectations and reality, because we know one thing, that no plan survives contact with reality in its perfect form. And I often refer back to this because it makes me laugh, Often we have an image of change in our minds and it's perfect, it's beautiful, it's Bake-Off standard, but the reality might look quite different. But when I look at the picture on the right, I've got a choice. Do I see a dodgy hedgehog with bad teeth? Or do I see a necessary step that I need to take in order to get better and possibly one day be able to make something like the perfect picture? And that's how this links back, I think, to the mindset question. And so much of this is about being kind to each other, which is why the final image that Lee included was to remember what makes you special. What unique contribution do you have in the world? And as groups, how much space are we creating for each other to be able to celebrate what makes each of us special? We saw Donna Bedian before. Donna Bedian, who is one of the doyens, the gurus of quality improvement. And he was asked a very simple question. What's the secret to improvement? And he said, ultimately, the secret of quality is love. And if you have love, you can work backward to monitor and improve the system. So there's 10 practical ways to think about resilience. And I'm going to come over now to Ian and Kate in the chat room and see what other ideas people have been sharing.
Okay. In terms of how we build our resilience, I think that the celebrate our achievements line certainly got things going in the chat room initially, and particularly that concept around joy and being joyful. Ian Gibson gave us a good suggestion about how to celebrate success. He says that their daily issues meeting every day always spends some time thinking about what they've done well over the last 24 hours. I thought that was a good tip. When we got onto that, how do you keep care of yourself, that whole self-care angle? Well, the chat room just lit up with ideas. Walks on the beaches, walking in the woods, yoga, singing, art, and even dancing the Lindy Hop came up on the chat. So quite a lot of suggestions coming through.
Great, thank you. And what about Kate or Lee?
So I kind of like separated it out in the fact that I think people kind of like split their ways of into two things. It was kind of like that connection with the environment around us, and that was kind of thinking about things like going out for a walk and connecting with the community and connecting with nature. Then there's also about connecting with oneself and reflecting, and that was through things, so just being still and taking time out, and listening to others around you, and then doing things such as yoga. And there was also quite a strong spiritual section about, you know, people praying and doing things like Tai Chi, and it was kind of like connecting to our spiritual well-being as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Kate. And Lee, did you want to add one?
Yes, thank you. People have been talking on Twitter about how important resilience is, and we need to talk about it more, and saying how we often find out where our limits are the hard way. So it's so important to invest in resilience as we go, self-care and things. And there's a couple of really lovely reflections on Twitter. There's one team that's done a compassion challenge, and another team that says in their team meetings they always celebrate achievements, which helps build their resilience. And there's lots about finding your people and sharing and supporting one another as well.
Fantastic, thank you. It leads quite well on to the next part, which is where I want to introduce an extension, if you like, of resilience. So I'm going to bring in some emerging research that's been coming from the United States in particular, around this idea that the Americans call grit. Okay, so grit is related to resilience, but it's distinct. Resilience is about the response to and interaction with setbacks, whereas grit describes much more of a characteristic that enables us to stick with something over time, despite the challenges that we face. And the research that I'm referring to particularly comes from Professor Angela Duckworth, and she defines grit as perseverance and passion for long-term goals. So grit is about, you know, doing what you love, but not falling in love. You know, it's about staying in love. And it's the set of characteristics that enable us to create and maintain purpose over a long period of time. So a note on the word passion, because when I first read this, you know, I misread it in a way, and I read passion for this idea of, you know, the lightning bolt moment, which is very prevalent as an icon in our culture. You know, how did you find your passion? When did you suddenly realize that you wanted to, I don't know, become a healthcare improvement expert or reform the police service or whatever it might be? And what her research shows is, for most people, that's not how it works, okay? So passion in this context is much less about intense emotions, much less about an obsession or an infatuation. It's much more about a sustained and enduring devotion to something over time. Okay, so in that sense, you know, this idea of fireworks is something of a red herring. Fireworks explode in a blaze of glory, and then they tend to fizzle away. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that when we think about grit and how we cultivate it, you know, do away with this idea that passion for work and vocation is something that suddenly happens upon us, and try to think more in the space of passion as a compass rather than a firework. You know, so something which guides us over time, it emerges over a period of years. And that the process of discovery is active. You know, we have to look at a compass to make sense of it. We have to inquire into the work that we're doing and the meaning that it has in order to discover what the passion is within it. In other words, in this context, to create and maintain purpose over time, that's something that we help to create. It's not something that simply happens to us. And that's how it links back to this idea of the growth mindset. So this is my chance to get a bit of payback on Helen, because she doesn't know that I'm going to reference her here. But, you know, when I think about grit, perseverance and passion for a long-term goal, you know, I think Helen is a brilliant example of that. somebody who has been leading healthcare improvement for 3 decades now. But for those of you who saw Helen's blog a couple of weeks ago, where she told her story of how she started to do this work, you'll have noticed something. You know, Helen didn't start working for the health service. She didn't start working in healthcare improvement. She started working in local government, and through that found a kind of interest in public service. And she followed that interest and refined it over a number of years, decades even. So, you know, we could put a narrative on this and say, you know, Helen's had this mission, which has been constant over time. And in one sense, that's true. But in another sense, you know, it's evolved through her process of actively pursuing it and following with a sustained devotion and effort a particular interest. So, you know, now it's not just about improving health by doing things better, but actually transforming healthcare by helping us to see better things to do. And that only came through grit, through the determination to stick with it over time. So what we've done is we've put the grit scale, the assessment tool that Professor Duckworth and her colleagues use, onto the learning management system. And you'll see that it has questions that cause us to reflect. Things like, do new ideas and projects sometimes distract me from the old ones? Do my interests change year to year? You know, am I someone who gets obsessed with an idea for a short time and later loses interest? And you might find as a reflective tool that it really helps you to focus on some of those big questions about what is the thing that I'm pursuing through time, and how can I better cultivate my grit to be able to do it? So we're nearly out of time. Before we end, I want to finish with one final idea. You know, often when people ask us about resilience, they're asking about their personal resilience. How do I cultivate resilience for myself? I want to suggest one idea that's happened to me through experience, which is this. When I have focused on how I build the resilience of other people, the process of doing that has made me more resilient at the same time. Okay, so what if in the process of supporting other people to build their resilience, we improve our own resilience over time? I'll give you an idea of what I mean. When we lead the cheers for other people, you know, when we coach someone in how to fight a winnable battle and help them to let something go, you know, when we send someone that we know is struggling a link to this school and maybe say, you know, let's talk afterwards about the module, all of those are small, concrete steps through which we build the resilience of others. But it may also be that that's a key way that we can do it for ourselves. So we'll be picking up on some of these themes in next week's modules, where we'll be looking at, just get to the right slide, there it is, where we'll be looking at mobilizing and organizing, which is a subject that is very close to my heart. So we'll be looking at public narrative and how we move from me into we, from the individual agent into the collective agency, which is going to transform public services in the future. In the meantime, we've got the learning management system, the first module of which is live on Change Starts With Me. And next week, we will be uploading the second module of that. And it's going to be pulling out in much more details the themes that we've been exploring today. How do I build resistance? How do I deal with resistance? And how do I support other people and make them more resilient? We've also, for those of you who haven't yet joined in, been running a series of Edge Talks. So these are small group sessions where you have the chance to discuss the ideas that we're exploring here and make sense of them with other people from right across the world. So these are upcoming, and I hope you'll be able to join us for a few of them. And at the end of school, we'll then be looking at the future of change. So the week after next, we're going to come on and look at the skills and characters that make people effective change agents for the future. The last thing I'll leave you with, if you haven't already done so, we are running hundreds of randomized coffee trials right across the world. We've done our first round of matches, but if you haven't yet joined in, here's the link that you need to join in next time and be paired with somebody for an exciting conversation. So thank you very much for today, and we look forward to seeing you on next week's module.